that I was just about to hit the start button on the podcast there, and it shows we are 100 listens away from 15,000 plays on our podcast through church. That includes every sermon, Sunday morning, um, Wednesday evening lessons. So it's a lot of folks. I don't know who they are. I don't know where they are. It don't really matter where they are or who they are. But some people are listening to it, and hopefully that's the case. I don't know if any of you all do or not. Most of y'all are here, but there are people that are listening to it as well. I do want to ask a question before we get started tonight about something that I'm probably pretty bad at. But how many of you all in the last bit of your life, or I don't know, it doesn't matter how long ago it's been, have bought a car or a house? Or if you haven't done it recently, I need you to think back to the last time you bought a car or you bought a house. Okay? So when you buy a car, the question is, what are you looking for? Well, if it's about time to get a new vehicle, we have a handful of things in mind that we might be looking for. All right. And it may depend on what we're going to use the car for. I remember when right before Will was born, we got a new car. Now, if we want to talk about all the things about the car I didn't like, we could probably list a lot of them. It was not our favorite vehicle, but we needed a car that would work with a small child. We had to be able to put a car seat into it. But it might be that you're taking a new job that's going to require you to travel a longer distance quite often. Well, we're going to look for something probably with better gas mileage, right? But it might be that we just need something that we're going to sport around in. I'm thinking about Leland's car right now. We're thinking about something that's going to look pretty sharp, whenever we get it. Kind of depends on what we're looking for. And, sometimes people buy cars and they'll say, well, gas mileage is 5 miles a gallon, but I just drive it to town once a month. It doesn't. House. When we're looking for a home, it probably depends on what you're looking for. The first house that Mary and I lived in was one floor. It had a basement with steps that went about like this. There was no handrails down the side, and there was laundry. The laundry was in the basement. Mary hated all that. All right, seemed fine to me, but she didn't like any of it down there the way it was. It had a partial garage under the house, but then it wasn't long after we had Will, we started thinking this set of steps that are going straight down might not be ideal for a child. And not only that, it was only about a 1/4 acre lot. And every time you went anywhere outside and did anything, the ball's going to roll down the hill into the parking lot of the bank or out into the street. If it went this way, we'd start looking for a house. We was looking for something, maybe a little bit more land, right? We need a little bit bigger because we need another bedroom for a child. We have these lists, right? But there's some things that we can look for that ultimately might not matter that much. But there are some things that we have to have in the house. Think about if you went and you saw the prettiest truck in the world, but the ignition didn't work. Well, that truck is pretty as can be, but it's not going to do very good for what you need, right? Or let's say we went to the house. This is 2022. I don't want y'all to tell me about the old times. But if we went to a house and they said, this is a beautiful house, but there's no bathroom. Probably not going to do it, right? Now, some of y'all might say, we didn't have a bathroom growing up, but you got one now, right? You're not moving back to it. But there's things that we're looking for that we would want. Tonight, we're going to ask the question, what should I be looking for in a church? And I want us to think about this in sort of a needs and wants category. But I also want us to think about this on the flip side. If you're trying to sell a truck, if you're trying to sell a car, what needs to be in there as well? Because the reality is nobody here might be looking for a church, but there are people that are coming to you that are looking for a church as well. And if we're not holding up our end of that deal, then we're not doing our part as well. So let's think about it sort of in a twofold approach right there. It's not uncommon for people to say this term or this statement, I am looking for a church. You ever heard somebody say that? Think about the times when you would say that. Maybe you said it yourself. There's a few different things that might make you say that. Sometimes people are frustrated with where they are worshiping. That becomes an issue for people. They don't like where they are worshiping. I know people that have dealt with that, people that maybe are dealing with that right now. But it might also be a situation where you move from point A to point B, and you would need somewhere to go. And so we think about what would be looking for. Well, we are obligated to assemble with Christians, right? Hebrews chapter 10, verse 24 and 25, we read, and let us consider one another in order to stir up love and good works, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together, as is the manner of some, but exhorting one another, and so much the more as you see the day approaching. And so we're told that we have to assemble. So the question then becomes, how do we decide about this? Well, our criteria might be different, okay? What we're looking for might be different. I have worshiped in churches that have hundreds of people in them, 3, 4, I don't know, maybe 500 people. That may be the largest that I've ever been. I've been in those kinds of churches. I also worshiped at Bethel one time, and I believe there was 10 people in the building. There were times at Dix River Bend where those numbers were very similar. Now, you can say what you want about anything between 500 and 10 and anywhere on the continuum, but that becomes preference, personal preference for us. Some people might not like hundreds of people there. It's a little too impersonal, perhaps. Some people might not like 10 because maybe the church can't do as much as something larger could. But what we have to keep in mind, our needs and our wants, we have to keep in mind what is preference and what is scriptural. And I want us to keep focused on that here today. So we're going to look at 3 questions about the church I'm looking for. Question number 1, is the gospel of Christ proclaimed? That's the first thing we're going to look for. And you probably thought the first thing was going to be, how many people go there? Or what's the building look like? Do they have good sound system? Is the paint pretty? First, is the gospel of Christ proclaimed? Church isn't a social club. Sometimes we get that confused, right? There's a social aspect to a place that's not necessarily a social club. So I want us to think about that. It serves sort of a dual role because there is a social aspect, because we are together, we are working together. You can't go somewhere where you hate all the people. You probably could, but it's not going to be much of an enjoyment for you. But the church's responsibility is, first of all, to proclaim the gospel of Christ. Ephesians 1:22 and 23 says that Christ is the head of the body, and Ephesians 5:25 to 27 tells us that Jesus died to produce that glorious church. And so the first thing we're looking for is Christ's gospel proclaimed? Well, consider how Christ is building or has built maybe his church. We maybe should say it that way. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 and verse 14 says Christ calls us through the gospel. So if we say, I am looking for a church, then that's the responsibility. We are called to the church through the gospel. And so where we need to look for is, what do I see in the gospel? Is what's in the gospel what's being taught or preached or spoken or whatever you want to use at this church? We see examples in Acts chapter 2 as we heed the gospel call that God or Lord adds us to his body. Acts 2 and 41, 2 and 47 adds us to the church. We read there in Acts chapter 2, the people, they were added to the church daily, those who were being saved. That's why it's so important for the gospel to be the most important thing, for it not to be perverted in any way. Turn to Galatians chapter 1. We'll look at verses 6 through 9. Galatians 1, chapter 1, verses 6 through 9. At the top of my Bible, it says here, only one gospel. I marvel that you are turning away so soon from him who called you in the grace of Christ to a different gospel, which is not another. But there are some who trouble you and want to pervert the gospel of Christ. But even if we or an angel from heaven preach any other gospel to you than what we have preached to you, let him be accursed. As we have said before, so now I say again, if anyone preaches any other gospel to you than what you have received, let him be accursed. And so we read here, not only in the teachings of Jesus, but then later what we see here with Paul talking to the Galatians here, that the most important thing is for them to be teaching what they had told them from the beginning, from the get-go. So there's no other gospel, there's no other proclamation, there's no other teaching that goes with that. Galatians says just that. A church can wear the name of Christ, but without the gospel, it's no more than just a name. Think about your house for just a second. It can be a frame. But got to have some stuff in it to make it that home, right? Think about that car. You can call it a car. I've seen some things that they called cars. I'm not convinced that those necessarily were cars. I regret to say that there are some things that we call churches that it may not be a church. We have to make sure that when we're looking for a church that the gospel is proclaimed, but we also have to think about it on our end. I've already got a church, but is our church proclaiming the gospel as well? That's just as important. Now, second question. Is the apostles' doctrine observed? Well, Acts 2:42 says the churches of the New Testament continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine and in the fellowship. Now, we think about the role of the apostles. Jesus called them one by one, right? We know the song. And so when Jesus brought these apostles, these disciples, these followers in to him, their responsibility was going to be important while Jesus was alive, but perhaps far greater importance once Jesus was gone. If we remember those stories, Jesus was always sort of, he was befuddled in a sense by his apostles because they never really could figure it out, right? They wanted to do this or do that. But when Jesus dies and they're all gathered in that upper room there afterwards, there at Pentecost, the Holy Spirit comes to those apostles and they go out, and that's when it becomes real, right? They go out and they have to teach and preach. See, here's the thing. If there were no apostles, when Jesus died, it would have all died right there with him. But there had to be somebody to take that out. That's why we read Matthew at the end. We read Mark at the end, the Great Commission, where they're told to go out and preach and teach the gospel to each and every creature in and around wherever they could go to be able to teach it. And so the question is that what we're doing? Here's why. Why does it matter? Well, that's what Paul referenced just a few minutes ago in Galatians chapter 1, verses 6-9, when he said, are you still following what you were taught to start with? Because if you're not, if you're so quickly turned away, as it said in chapter 1 and verse 6 of Galatians, then what's happening is you've left behind the doctrine of the apostles. The apostles' doctrine has to be continued. Our goal is to be like those same faithful churches that we were seeing back then. Now, such a church would have worship like that was described in communion. We talked a little bit about this morning, right? We talked about singing. We talked about praying. We talked about communion. We talked about preaching. We talked about prayer. And as we read earlier a minute ago, in Hebrews chapter 10, the assembly should stir one another up to love and good works. That has to be taking place. So when we see what did they do in the early church, well, if I go somewhere where they're not doing what was done in the early church, then I have so soon moved away from the gospel. But I can't just be doing it out of rote memorization. I can't just be doing it. Well, it's time to preach. Well, it's time for communion. You know, have you ever been somewhere and taking communion where it's like, all right, take the cup. You ever follow? If we're not careful, we're like, well, I got to do this. We got to do this. We got to do this. We've talked about that many times on Wednesday night. Ben has mentioned how that if we're not careful, that old law became that checklist, right? Do this, but there was no heart in it. The church has to have that heart within it as well. That's why Hebrews 10 right there is so important. We have to stir each other up. We have to help each other. Is our church doing that? The work of the congregation has to be similar to what's found in the New Testament. We read the scripture just a moment ago, Ephesians chapter 4, chapter 4, verses 11 through 16, where it said that it was equipping the saints for ministry. You know what equipment is, right? I was asking my students the other day, we talked about equipment, and I said, I got several kids in one class that play football, and I said, imagine if the coach sent you out there and you've got on the knee pads and the shoulder pads, and you've got everything on, but you don't take a helmet. And they all looked at me and said, we'd probably get killed, Mr. Evans. I was like, yeah, you probably would. We got to be fully equipped. Well, the church's responsibility is to equip its members for the ministry. You say, I'm not the preacher. No, you're not. But you kind of are, right? Because you're the one that's taking the church out there. So you need to be equipped. We read there in Ephesians all the stuff that you need to put on, right? The breastplate of righteousness and all that. Well, you got to have that stuff to prepare us for what we are going forward to do. The church's responsibility is to spread the gospel. And it's also to meet the needs of the saints as problems arise. Is the church doing that? The organization has to look like what we saw in the Old Testament, or excuse me, in the New Testament. We got elders, right? You can look and see, where does it describe elders? Well, 1 Timothy chapter 3 and Titus chapter 1 both give those outlines for what an elder should be. Several weeks ago, we talked on Wednesday night about the two different descriptors of outline for elders and for deacons, what they should do and what they shouldn't do. And it's a pretty long list, right? It's a list of things that needs to be there. Well, why is it there? 1 Timothy, Titus, both written by by Paul, but they were written to people to encourage the growth of the church. The eldership plays an important role in that. 1 Timothy 3 drops down a little further, and it talks about those same qualifications for deacons as well. And you say, well, I'm not a deacon. I'm not an elder. I'm not qualified. So that just means that I don't have to worry about anything. We'll let him do it, right? Or we'll let him do it. Well, no, because there's a responsibility for the members within that apostles' doctrine as well. Turn to 1 Peter chapter 2. We're going to look at verses 9 through 12. 1 Peter 2, 9 through 12. Starting with verse 9, we read 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 9 through 12. We read here, but you are a chosen generation, right? A royal priesthood, a holy nation, his own special people, that you may proclaim the praises of him who called you out of darkness and into his marvelous light, who once were not a people, but are now the people of God, who had not obtained mercy, but now have obtained mercy. That's a description of us as Christians there, right? What we once had been and what we are now. Verse 11, beloved, I beg you as sojourners and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lusts which war against the soul, having your conduct honorable among the Gentiles, that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may, by your good works which they observe, glorify God in the day of visitation. So our responsibility as a member is to carry on this, to think about, first of all, what has been given to us. We talked this morning about duty and privilege. What has been given to us, but then also, how do I conduct myself going forward as well? How am I carrying myself out? Because somebody's going to say, I'm looking for a church. And every time I see her, I see something good happening. I see someone carrying themselves in the right way. And that seems like an operation, an organization, a place that I would like to be part of. If you went to a church and every single person there was acting awful and terrible and we wouldn't want to be part of it, right? But what if you were the person who's carrying on that way? Nobody's going to want to be part of that either, right? It's a responsibility of us to go forward. Third question, is there righteousness, peace, and joy? Romans 14:17 says, for the kingdom of God is not eating and drinking, but righteousness and peace and joy in the Holy Spirit. I think these are three things that every one of us want, probably in everything, right? It's sad, but I've seen people that I know, but also students that I have in school who live in a home that really lacks none of these things. And I think it's incredible to me that this kid gets to school every day. What if the church was like that? What if the church lacked righteousness and lacked peace and lacked joy? Be difficult, right? We would struggle with wanting to be part of something like that. So let's think about it for a second. The church should be a place where brethren are focused on peace and edification. Edification is to build people up, right? We want to be focused on peace. We want to be peaceful when we come together. I don't like being in chaotic situations, okay? I don't like to be in chaotic situations. I don't mean like in a city where there's a ton of, that doesn't really bother me. But I mean in a situation where it just seems like there's chaos in the room. You ever been in that situation before? And you think, if I ever get out of here, I'm never going to come back, right? Well, sometimes we can't help it. Sometimes work gets to be like that. Sometimes things that we deal with gets to be like that. But the church doesn't need to be like that. But why is it that places get like that? It's because of the sort of chaos that we invite in. The responsibility of the church is to bring peace within, but also edification, to build up one another within the church, because that is a responsibility as well. You have to feel like you're right here, but I have to get you to right there. Because here's the thing, if you walk in this door and I knock you to here, well, you're going to get to about here, but then you come up next week and I'm going to knock you back to here. Pretty soon, you're not going to come back. The role of the church is to edify, to build up, to whatever you are doing that will benefit the church. We're going to magnify, we're going to blow that up as much as we possibly can. Because without the church, without you, took my line away. Without you, there is no church, right? You are the most important part of it. We have to build that up. John chapter 17, verses 22-23. I want you to follow along with me. I do not pray for these alone, but also for those who will believe in me through their word, that they all may be one, as you, Father, are in me and I in you, that they also may be one in us, that the world may believe that you sent me. And the glory which you gave me, I have given them, that they may be one just as we are one. I in them, you in me, that they may be made perfect in one, and that the world may know that you have sent me and have loved them as you have loved me. That's peace and edification all there in the same time. We are all one right there, but not all just one together. We're one within this building, but we're all one with who? With Christ, right? And we're all one with Christ, but Christ was sent by who? God. And so we sort of transitive property this. If I am one with Christ and Christ is one with God, then I am with God right there. So there's that peace, there's that edifying, and that goes all the way back to the very beginning. That takes us back into that's early days stuff. John, right there, we're reading that same thing. We're still the same way today, still connected. The church has to be a place that pursues things that build up the brethren. You can look around. It's real easy to look around and say there's 30 people here. Can't do nothing. Here we are. We can fall into those kinds of traps really quickly, right? But that's not what we read there in First Corinthians chapter 14:26. It's first we're to build up the brethren. I don't know about you all, but the littlest things sort of build me up. The other night when we packed up the candy for Halloween, it didn't take no time to do it, and everybody was working really quick. Those are some of the most fun things that we do, just personally, those kinds of things. And it takes no real skill, right? You know, if you can keep the bag from breaking, if you can count to 6 or 7, we can dump them in, it's pretty good. Some of us struggled with all of that. I think I broke every bag that I put them in. But those kinds of things are what encourage us, right? We see others trying to benefit, trying to help others. And I don't know who got the candy, and I don't know if they threw it all in the trash or if they ate every bit of it. They might have walked away cursing the church afterwards, and that doesn't matter. How much did the church build each other up by working together on that kind of thing? And think about the other things that we can do there as well. 1 Corinthians 14 and verse 26. But also, we want to, as we see in Romans chapter 16, avoid those who cause divisions by placing stumbling blocks. Because when we went back there and put those things in the bag, it would be real easy for us to say, I bet nobody will come to church because of this. Be easy to fall into that trap, wouldn't it? We did it last year and nobody came. Well, those are stumbling blocks, right? That's the wrong attitude to have. That's not our worry about that. When Jesus died on the cross after preaching for 3 years, how many people was with him? A whole lot fewer than how many he'd talked to. And I'll be real honest with you, there were a whole lot of people that ate when Jesus gave it to him, but wasn't standing there at the cross the day that he died, was not interested in it. They might take the candy. I don't know what they're going to do with the candy. I'm not worried about that. I'm not going to put a stumbling block. I'm not going to put something in the ground that's going to make it hard for us to go forward. Our church, the church that they're looking for, has to have righteousness, peace, and joy. And we're the righteousness, peace, and joy that they're looking for. That's our responsibility. So the question is, have you found what you're looking for? Or are we what other people are looking for? Well, first of all, unless the gospel is preached in its simplicity and purity, a church can't be pleasing unto the Lord. So that's the first thing. That's the first thing we looked at. You got to have that to start with. Second, a church seeking to please Christ has to let the apostles' doctrine guide its worship, has to guide its work and organization, and it can't be based on those traditions of men. If not, we become a little more traditional and a little less apostles' doctrine. If somebody ever says, why do you do this? at church. We need to be able to give a description, a reason why. And you say, I don't remember that. We've got little cards that tell exactly why we do things. But we can turn those questions around and say, why do you do this? If the answer is because we've always done it, it's the wrong answer. If there's a scriptural reason, then that's the right answer. Don't let the traditions of men become scriptural. Third, a church should be conducive to spiritual growth where people are encouraged to live lives of peace and joy. If we're growing spiritually, nobody's ever grown spiritually and lost their peace and joy. It's an oxymoron. It doesn't work that way, right? If you grow spiritually, that peace and joy is going to grow with you as well. Last on the screen there, the programs, the people, the children. That's all fine. But first and foremost, let's focus on the teaching and preaching of the gospel. You'll notice what we didn't talk anything about tonight. We didn't talk about how many people were in the building. We didn't talk about the kind of programs that we had. Oh, we included them in there. But that's not the stuff that we're necessarily focused for. And too often, the things that people look for in a church are those sort of shiny things. But when you drive it off the lot, it don't work anymore, right? But whenever we're focused on the things scripturally that we should be, when we're handling the church the way that the apostles taught, when we're following the words of Jesus Christ, then not only have we found what we're looking for, but we're the looking for that other people are trying to find on the way. Is there anything we can do for you? Any way we can help you, whatever we can do, we'd invite you to come while we stand and sing.